A very good morning to the DGAP Geopolitical Morning Briefing. It's a real pleasure to see you and talk to you this morning. We are discussing today a newly released report on reforming and enlarging the EU for the 21st century, sailing on high seas, as the title says. And we have two co-authors of the report here with us. And I'm really happy to welcome both of you today. Daniela Schwarzer is a member of the executive board of Bertelsmann Stiftung, and Shaheen Vallet is actually a senior fellow at DGAP, and he is French. So we have a German and a French presenting this Franco-German report that was originally commissioned by Anna Löhrmann and Laurence Boone, the respective Europe state secretaries state ministers in Germany and in France. The report really touches on a key issue, namely how to reform and how to enlarge this European Union at this critical juncture, and has received a lot of attention in the public debate. It is also debated in the General Affairs Council of the European Union. I think some of the ideas and discussions will also feed the Granada meeting of leaders of the European Council. And with us today is also Elmar Brok to give us, I hope, a critical view on the report. Elmar Brok, I think, needs no introduction, but let me just say he is a member of the Christian Democratic Party, CDU, and has been in the European Parliament, I would say, for many decades, and has therefore shaped European decision-making, European policies in different positions at the highest level of responsibility. And so I think this is going to be a great debate. And so I want to thank all of you for joining. I want to thank the DGAP team for putting this morning briefing together, in particular Jan Stöckmann, Milanic, and the entire communications and events teams. I think this is going to be a very interesting debate, and we are very much looking forward, of course, also to your questions after the first half an hour, so we have time for an interactive discussion. Let me start with Daniela. Daniela, give us perhaps an overview of the key recommendations, the key results of your report.
Well, thank you very much, Guntram, for hosting us. It's a real pleasure to speak about the report this morning. And let me maybe start, I have 5 minutes, more or less, I think, to give you, first of all, an insight into how we approach the issue, because our mandate was to prepare a Franco-German report on an EU institutional reform. And of course, this is happening in a particular situation because the enlargement of the European Union has made it back centrally onto the European agenda. There is a strong commitment by the French and the German political leadership, not only to enlarge the European Union, but President Emmanuel Macron, as much as Olaf Scholz, have both said that the EU needs to be reformed before it can admit new members. Right now, there is a possibility that 8 additional countries join the European Union. And so the question that was put to us is how the EU can prepare for this and how it can improve its functioning, also with regards to rule of law and democratic legitimacy. Now, we operationalized this mandate after, several hours of discussion, including with the 2 ministers for European affairs who had mandated us. And we said we will look at the European Union basically as it is. We are not going to suggest a disruption of the system, which maybe some have thought we could do, not in our group though. But we said we will use what we know works, and that is in particular the EU as a hybrid system, where you have a channel of legitimacy coming through the European Parliament. You have another one coming through the Council of Ministers and the European Council. And then there is the European Commission as the guardian of the treaties. So we said this basic setup for us is a given. We will not disrupt that. However, we did look at 3 things, and those guided our selection of topics that we approach in the report. We said, our reform proposals need to increase the capacity to act of the European Union. They need to pay into democratic legitimacy and transparency, and in particular rule of law. And thirdly, they need to make the EU institutions enlargement ready. We then also looked at the overall architecture of the European Union as part of a wider continent. The reason for that is that we did acknowledge that the situation is new while the debate on EU institutional reform is very old. What is new now is the geopolitical context, which on the one hand makes it more urgent for the European Union to strengthen itself and to organize its ties to other countries around its neighbors on the continent. But on the other hand, we very well know that it is more and more difficult to reform anything in the European Union where you need unanimity. So while we look at the core of the European Union and suggest a number of proposals how to improve the inner functioning of the EU, we also look at the question how we should think about differentiation within the European Union and vis-a-vis its neighbors and accession countries. So we do not suggest an alternative to enlargement in any way, but first of all, we do say in one place, we can't, this is not our mandate, we're not supposed to go into staged accession or any new model how to manage the accession process, although that is a really interesting question, but not for this report. We do argue that we believe that the European Union needs to be far more ambitious, thinking about the way it approaches its own neighbors to build more solid ties with those countries that do not have a wish to join the European Union as full members, but with which we have a strong mutual interest to have the closest and most stable relationship, be it in security and economic and energy or whichever terms. So you will see that one of the later chapters actually looks at the EU in its geographical context and gives a picture which is very much contested out there of concentric circles. This is just an sort of a spotlight on how we think the EU already is situated in its neighborhood, and we make some proposals how to develop this further. Now, for reasons of time, I cannot go into much detail at this point. I'm happy to answer all kinds of questions, and Shaheen will pick up a number of concrete reforms. Let me just say that you will see that the report actually begins with the chapter on rule of law after outlining the geopolitical context and the political context of enlargement. Why did we do that? Because we think that this is the biggest challenge. If the EU enlarges, and some may argue it should enlarge quickly for geopolitical reasons, our point is that we say there shouldn't be concessions on the standards for accession countries, and there needs to be more in terms of securing rule of law within the EU already as it is today, and in particular if it grows even further. So our first two concrete proposals are that the rule of law mechanism in Article 7 should be strengthened, because we've seen over the past years that it hasn't worked as it should have, because no one was really prepared for the situation that the EU has to defend its fundamental principles within its own member states. And the second proposal which we made is that the EU should be far more ambitious in defining conditionality in its own funding policies. We have a very good example now with the Next Gen EU Fund, where this has been built in, and we take this and develop it further and say for major spending in the European Union, this should be applied. It is not only as a mechanism to push others to respect fundamental principles that they signed up to, but from our perspective, it is also a way of guaranteeing that spending and financial solidarity between EU countries is legitimate. Because if money flows into the EU and then with that into other EU member states, and the fundamental principles of functioning are respected, this will eventually pose a legitimacy problem for the donor countries. Just one last remark. Those two proposals already show you two things. We make proposals that can be implemented without treaty reform through negotiation between the member states or through the amendment of secondary law. But with what I said about Article 7, it becomes clear we also make proposals how to reform the EU treaties it is almost a political taboo in quite a number of member states. But we, as experts, we were asked to really look at the functioning, and we said the way these reforms are going to be implemented will be part of our reflection. But we will not stop short of suggesting treaty change where we think it is useful and should be done. And you will see in the last chapter a very detailed analysis how treaty change can be brought about. And we also, look at the sequence of things. Our group was convinced that institutional reform should happen before or with enlargement. There are others out there who say, yes, we need to reform the EU, but enlargement should go first for the geopolitical reasons. This is a suggestion we as a group did not subscribe to. We see a clear sequencing. We argue the EU needs to make itself enlargement ready. We do not think the Lisbon Treaty can cover it all, while it can cover a lot. So that should be used very clearly. But we do make additional suggestions that in part could be implemented as soon as the accession treaties are signed and ratified. Because accession treaties can be used to change EU primary law for issues that are relevant to the functioning of the enlarged European Union. I'll leave it there for an overview. There are many detailed proposals in the report. In some cases, we don't give one clear recommendation, but we weigh options. You will find pros and cons or costs of non-action also clearly formulated, because as a bottom line, I can say that our group was deeply convinced that the EU needs to be further developed. Others are working on this too. The European Parliament is working on this, as a report. Right. Other countries are also putting in place groups. So we are really part of a very broad European debate by now, and I'm very glad that this has picked up in that way. This is just one contribution.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. I think there's already a lot on the table that you put on the table here. And, we really need to zoom in on some of these issues. But the report, of course, is 60 pages long, so we cannot discuss every detail, but we do put the link to the report in the chat. So if you want to read, as our audience, the report, please go on the chat and download the report. And perhaps, Daniela, just one word, what's the perception of the report? I mean, just very, very quickly so that we get to Shaheen.
Yes, thank you, Burkhard. So we presented the report twice in the General Affairs Council, once in May as a kind of interim status. And, we gave an idea of how we work, what the issues are that we approach. We spoke about our methodology, and in particular also of the sequencing, that we go into some short-term and some longer-term issues, because we do think the European elections coming up in June are a very important point that needs to be very consciously prepared by the member states, not to go into a situation where there is an institutional mess, for instance, over the question of the choice of the new EU leadership. In May, the General Affairs Council was almost questioning the need, I would say. I mean, not openly, but you felt the ministers present weren't really jumping on the issue, didn't come with clear positions. They were interested, and it was more like, a quite distant intellectual, in some cases very political, but in those cases, like a questioning conversation. And we came back in September, and the situation, and this time with a full report. So that's basically, that was on September 19th. The situation was very different. First of all, our report was one, and the Lithuanian government had also asked a think tank group to prepare something which is really good. So there were two contributions to the debate that were actually discussed. The ministers met the night before to discuss the other report. So there was a readiness by some of the ministers present to pick up concrete proposals and actually have a statement on them. There was a fundamental debate about the need to touch the treaties. And you heard both positions, but there's a lot of political caution. But there was real readiness to go into some of the proposals we make. And we were, of course, asked about our independence. So is this a Franco-German consolidated government compromise? And of course, it is not. It is an expert contribution. And we see that both governments embrace it in different ways and not the same parts. It is really our work. We weren't asked to, to respect any certain points or include this or not have that.
No, it's an independent report.
Political reaction.
Yes.
Sorry, one word on the media. The media were
very
really grasping this around the EU, but very interestingly also in the UK. So we had so many interviews with British outlets asking us, where are we in your report? And the honest answer was actually we didn't even discuss the UK. There is one half sentence about where the UK could sit in our circle model, but this is not because we were talking about the UK. And it's very interesting. I think the depth of the discussion and the activity still today that we are asked to give interviews and explain shows that there is a readiness to discuss the big questions of European architecture at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniela. And certainly the Brits haven't yet gotten over their Brexit experience and still think about their relation with Europe and the European Union. Now, I do want to, I do want to mention, since it was already posted in the chat, Daniela, you've also just written a book on Krisenzeiten, crisis times. So I think that's a very interesting contribution. So that is not directly related here, but I think that links up to many of the sort of fundamental issues that we are facing here. But let me now turn to, and I wanted to advertise one more point. I mean, so this is obviously a Franco-German report. We do want to engage in a debate with many countries in Eastern Europe. You mentioned the Lithuanian report. And we do have actually an event upcoming where some of you from the Franco-German group will present, but where we will also have a couple of speakers from Eastern Europe, and it's going to be held together with the Jacques Delors Institute. And I think the link will also be put in the chat. Now, Shaheen, you are the French co-author, and I'm afraid your co-author spoke already for quite some time. So I really have to ask you to be very disciplined, because I do want to give the space to Elmar. Perhaps you really just pick up one issue which is particularly relevant in the French debate also, and spend a few minutes on that, and then I go straight to Elmar. Please, Shaheen.
Thank you, Guntram. I give a very good overview. I want to stress 3 points that were most controversial. I think one is the date of 2030, which we've put in the report deliberately as a target date for the EU to be ready and for exceeding member states to also be ready. I think that date has created some controversy. For us, it was important to set that date to also give a clear timeline, both for the enlargement, maybe more importantly so for deepening. And that basically is a way to put pressure and to put the question of institutional reform on the agenda of the next European Parliament and next European Commission. If we had not had that date, we think that it would have been to slip much longer timeline. I think the second point that was quite controversial in our report is the question of the expansion of QMV. And we really thought this was an important dimension, which was actually very central to the speech of Chancellor in August of 2020.
So just to say, QMV is qualified majority voting for those that don't.
Yes. Sorry for the jargon for people who are not familiar. But the idea behind the Scholz speech in August was that Europe, in order to deepen, needed to make a compromise, in particular between France and Germany, on the expansion of qualified majority voting and the abandon of veto rights. And so, Scholz presented what could be seen as a quid pro quo between France and Germany. France on QMV for foreign policy, and Germany making a concession for QMV on tax policy. What we discuss in the report is a broader package that is not only a Franco-German package, but that covers a broader range of issues, including defense policy, including fiscal policy beyond taxation. And that makes a link to a third point, which is quite important in the report, is the notion that this enlargement and this deepening of Europe has quite important budgetary consequences. What we argue for in this report, budget as it stands today, is not fit for the Europe of tomorrow, and therefore we need a much larger EU budget, of course in absolute term, because we have a growing number of member states, but also in proportion of GDP, because competences of the EU would need to expand as a result of that. And that leads to a question about how do we create own resources for this EU budget, and how do we creates the framework to have, if not a permanent, at least an easier way to borrow in the EU, and that means consolidating current borrowing instruments that are sometimes taking place under intergovernmental framework. So this is a third idea which hasn't been picked up all that much in the press, including in the German press, to my surprise. Was an important part of the report, and maybe one that is more controversial. So these are the sort of the 3 points I wanted to share and have a discussion around today and in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Shaheen. So let me turn to Elmar Brok. Elmar, we've heard I think here a very ambitious report talking about qualified majority voting, first reforming, then enlarging, joint European debt, the rule of law, Article 7. I mean, lots of things that are have been in the debate for many, many years, and you've seen them in the debate, and you've seen also where it all went in the debate. So what's your take on the report when you read the report?
First of all, I must say I'm very happy about this report. I do not agree with every detail, but that is not the important point in such a moment. This report is an opening of the debate in very crucial matters, mostly going in the right direction. And I believe very much that we should talk about the conditionality of strengthening majority voting, qualified majority voting, and enlargement. We had it already in the time of the Treaty of Nice, and especially of the Treaty of Lisbon, which were done first with the formula deepening before widening. One then said widening and deepening together. And that was, at the end of the day, more or less successful for the preparation of the enlargement 2004-2007. And it was an incredible progress. But if we will have in the future 30, 35 member countries or even more, then we cannot go forward with this situation. And therefore, we have to do our homework. The candidate countries have to do their homework to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria. But the integration capacity of the European Union is part of the Copenhagen criteria, but nobody talks about that. Therefore, I'm very thankful that this opening is there. And we need especially the questions of better decision-making procedures. And here this paper makes a lot of positive proposals from making qualified majority voting the normal system, including the full co-decision rights of the European Parliament in that. And then it said about certain other questions, budget, taxes, defense. Look into foreign and security and defense policy. If we do not come forward with that, Cyprus can stop everyone, or Hungary. And that is lacking perhaps in that report, but perhaps France and Germany cannot do it firsthand, but that should be debated and discussed with candidate countries and our Eastern and Central European friends who are for enlargement, but against qualified majority voting in this question, that this is not working. And the moment it is so, and that's the idea of the European Union, that every country sits on every table of decisions. Therefore, it's also a side remark, the proposals for the Commission to have, as we called it, a main commissioner and a junior commissioner, but with voting rights. Every country should sit on every table, but make it not practical. That is also in foreign security policy, that this country sits on the table, but if this system becomes more and more inefficient, then the bigger countries will do it alone again. We see already the first signs of that. And that would mean that this country lose any impact, any influence in that question. Foreign security policy will not anymore a policy of the European Union, but of these bigger member countries. And then we'll fall back in the time before European integration in practical terms. And therefore, we should explain smaller countries that it's in their interest that also in these questions, efficient decision-making procedures should be adapted. And I think there's a lot of proposals which meet that very practically. For example, in budget questions, we Germans have to know, so long we have their anonymity, there will be all the time one or two or three member countries blackmailing to get more money. This majority voting that can be solved. It becomes cheaper for Germany in that question. Such an argumentation should we see, and to take that blackmailing system away. We should see that we have to do it in taxation, in internal market-related taxation, not in all of the taxation. And that this is especially also seen now on the German government, I think is a positive development. We took sometimes a little bit too much in that report. Probably our friends have thought about it with sovereignty of member states. We should also talk about it that some sovereignty in this global environment can get only via Europe, not nationally. And that, I think, is an important argument to overcome this purely national sovereignty question, despite I can understand that because of historical reason that it's there. I have one main problem. That is the question of legitimation by the European Parliament. And here I would like to ask Daniela and Shaheen to explain it more to me. What should we do with all this associated solutions, circles, and so on? It's mentioned in money question, do it like next generation, it's praised. Which influence the Parliament has then? Next generation, the European Parliament had no decision-making powers as it's foreseen in the budget. We have to see that all budget question has to put in the ordinary budget decision-making system. Otherwise, the most of the money is done then just between governments and has no democratic legitimacy. And that might be practical in certain questions, but that's the problem. The circles is also the question of legislation. If you have collision of the willings, how you want to deal with legislation, especially when it comes to internal market question. Can the European Parliament as a whole deal with that? Or should we not talk about it as Jacques Delors called it, avant-garde solutions? Some countries go forward, but within the system of the European Union, and then the European Parliament has legislative powers on that too, because it's also foreseen at the end of the day for all the other countries. I think here are still questions to set in order not to destroy that question of democratic legitimacy. And one last point I would like to make with the Spitzenkandidaten process. I'm against a solution with the Council. The treaty says everything, but it's the question of the power and ability of the European Parliament. If the European Parliament is ready to make one proposal, the majority vote within the European Parliament, then this is the candidate. And here the Parliament has to find a way to do so and should not be hunted by the Council in timing. Because as in national parliaments, when you set up a government, political groups have to brought together, they have to discuss things, and then they make a proposal. It's written in the treaty, the Council can only make the proposal with taking into account the result of the elections and after consultation with the European Parliament. This consultation process is not properly done until now, and here the European Parliament should be more united than last time to force the Council to accept such a procedure. Otherwise, the Parliament will not elect Commission President and the Commission. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elmar. I do have one more question for you, and then I want to pose a few questions to Daniela and to Shaheen. I mean, the question I want to pose to you, Elmar, is on the QMV. You made a very strong case for qualified majority voting. And of course, I want to question you on what's the position and how do you react with the criticism from Central and Eastern Europe to that? I mean, we had, for example, Radek Sikorski in an event recently here at DGAP, and he was basically saying, look, QMV decisions in foreign and security policies means another Minsk. France and Germany ganging up together, overruling the Central and Eastern Europeans, in particular in their relation to Russia, not taking properly account of the security interests and the foreign policy interests of that region in the world. You know, just to get your reaction to this criticism, which I think is a very strong criticism, and which we hear very loudly at this stage. And perhaps, since I have you there, there is this one sentence in the report which also surprised me, that in foreign security and defense policy, the EP shouldn't be involved, right? I mean, shouldn't be in co-decision. And perhaps you can also say one word on that. And then I want to come to Daniela and Shaheen.
Look, in the role of the European Parliament, I have nothing against what it said. European co-decision is on legislation. Also, the German Parliament has not real rights on foreign policy. The foreign policy is mostly the duty of the executive branch, and the Parliament has to control it. They have to bring the politicians to the committees. But the Parliament has also an important word in that. The Parliament has to decide the budget. The Parliament has the role setting up the High Representative Vice President of the Commission, and many other possibilities. That's the classical question of the Parliament's and foreign security policy, and therefore cannot every decision taken in the European Parliament in foreign policy. There's a different role also in national parliaments. The question, what my friend Radek has said, is just wrong. First of all, Germany and France can nothing decide about. And therefore, even if it takes the normal qualified majority voting, where also this report makes proposals in favor of the smaller countries, medium-sized countries, which is considerable to do that. But we can use in foreign security policy, at least in the beginning, super qualified majority voting. And to find a way, to find a compromise out of that. That is also in that report discussed, what I find very good. But when you use that 55 countries, 50% of the countries have to agree, and this represents 65% of the population, then not very such cases can be decided against Poland and not against all of Central and Eastern European countries. That is just wrong. With a super qualified majority, you can overcome that. And therefore, I believe we have more possibilities without a veto, and that Viktor Orban cannot decide about our policy towards Russia. Then it's very much in favor of Poland, at least for a Poland which perhaps the new government, Radek Sikorski might be a member. And I believe that this argumentation is wrong. But I have one point I want to mention, also that Article 7, I think that's partly very good proposals, but I forgot to say that which role plays here in other cases in European Court of Justice, which does not play any role, if I have seen it rightly, in that report.
Wonderful. So let me bring in also, if we can get all speakers on the screen, let me bring in also our audience. Please do put your questions in the chat and raise your hands, and I can then give you the floor. And you know, until we see the first questions, let me just throw the question at Shaheen and Daniela about this issue that Elmar touched on, which is sort of the question of the sovereignty and the role of the member state, and whether we shouldn't actually see a bit more of a transfer of sovereignty really to the European level. You talk in your report about sovereignty. I think you call it safeguards, something like this. So when something is against the central national interest, then there are some safeguards. Perhaps you can just explain what that means in very practical terms. I think that is certainly, from my point of view, a big issue, and it relates to also your proposal. I think it's under the protection of the institutional challenges, where you talk about the joint chamber of the highest courts and tribunals of the EU to enhance judicial dialogue. Is this sort of an acceptance that the European Court of Justice isn't the Supreme Court, and we have to accept the ultra vires sovereignty of the national constitutional courts? So perhaps you can just give us a bit of a sense of that debate, and try to do it concisely so that we bring in the audience also. Please, I don't know who wants to take those two questions. Shaheen, you start.
I can say a word on the court if you want.
Please, yeah.
Neither Daniela nor I are real lawyers or legal scholars, but I think the idea was to structure what lawyers refer to as the dialogue of the judges, and that over the last few years, this dialogue of the judges, which has taken place over the last decades, has become more confrontational, more messy, and more unpredictable. And that, it might be for national constitutional courts and the ECJ to engage in this dialogue through a battle of case law. It might be better to structure a forum for discussion between judges and between courts. I don't think that way that it weakens the superseding powers of the European Court of Justice when it comes to ruling on EU law, but I think it is trying to format and structure a dialogue which sometimes has been messy, in part, if I may say, in this German format, due to tension between the German Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice, but also having spillover consequences on the dialogue between, for instance, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal and the ECJ. So, and to take the French blame too, in the Conseil d'État and the Constitutional Court. So, I think there might be a better way of structuring this dialogue of judges than what we currently do, and this was an attempt in this report to propose a way. But in no way one that weakens the powers.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Daniela, do you want to talk about the sovereignty and the ultimate sort of safeguards?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Yes, just one additional remark on the ECJ. We say in several chapters of the report how much we think the role of the ECJ should be reaffirmed. That comes with the really strong support for rule of law as a more defendable principle and something that we see as absolutely non-negotiable. And that has to do, of course, with the role that the ECJ needs to play within the single market. So there we are absolutely clear, and there's no, nothing we think can be negotiated for those countries who want to be full EU members. Interestingly, we discussed a lot whether there's any chance, given the political situation within the European Union, where some countries do not respect rule of law and question the role of the ECJ, is there a way to accommodate this through differentiation? And we actually came to the conclusion, no. This is a fundamental thing within EU membership, and if you don't abide by that, you need to move somewhere else if that is not compatible with your legal tradition, or you suddenly change your mind, you never wanted this, but you signed up to it. So then you have to find a way to deal with it, but not within the core EU membership. Now on sovereignty, actually, the proposals we have, and it's pretty long. I just checked in the report, our chapter on decision-making in the council of the subject is probably one of the longest. Why? because it's not only a technical one, but we really try to strike a political balance, because this debate has been out there. The German EU presidency, a while ago, pushed it already, more QMV and CFSP. Today, nothing really has moved except for the discussion is there. There are groups of friends of QMV, there are others who don't want it. So what we do, first of all, we explain how we think the QMV can be extended to other policy areas. And then indeed, we come up with what we call the safety or the sovereign safety net. Because we say otherwise we will not get the adoption of QMV politically acceptable. And what we say is, for one, and Emma already touched on that, we say, okay, there needs to be a rebalancing of voting shares. We suggest to go to 60-60 of member states representing member states and population. And we think that is one of the proposals that shows actually that we are not necessarily serving the French and the German interest with our work, but we actually work independently, because this relatively weakens the weight of the large member states. And the second point for the sovereign safety net, we basically say that member states, if they see a vital interest being touched, they need to be able to bring a decision to the European Council, and that this way you can tell them, even if there is something that can be decided with QMV after a shift of voting procedure, you can have your vital national interests protected. We also think, and that's not in the report because it's less of a recommendation, but of a let's say, of a political assessment, that the extension of QMV is not only valuable because you will technically be able to apply a different voting system, but because it can change the dynamics in the European Council. Because, you know, even if there is a qualified majority vote for a certain issue, which is really tedious, there will still be a willingness to compromise. And the change of the voting rules may remind national representatives more that there is a real need to forge a consensus. So this is a topic which, you know, we discussed with people who work in the council, or, you know, who have a lot of observation about the mechanics and the politics of decision-making. And in one conversation, we were told clearly that there is this impulse that will be set by changing the rules, which goes beyond the legality. It's really political. I wish to make one comment on differentiated integration and Emma's question with regards to legislation and the European Parliament. We actually don't suggest to change, when it comes to internal differentiation, to change the current treaty provisions in Lisbon with regards to the preference that should be given, and we totally abide by that or subscribe to that, to work within the EU institutional system wherever possible. We do not suggest an Europe à la carte, which becomes very intergovernmental. We actually say there needs to be conditions in place, and they are with the current treaty, they can be enhanced, that groups move ahead, but within the institutional framework. For the budget, in our ideal world, the conditionality question, which you touched upon, would be in the multi-annual financial framework. So with full, you know, role of the European Parliament as it has. At the moment, of course, you know, we don't know whether that's politically feasible. So we use the Next Gen EU as a best practice example, not so much for the decision-making, how it came there, but for how you can link expenditure and conditionality in a way that really changes the game for countries that don't abide by the rules.
Right. Okay. So let's bring in a few of the questions, and I'll just read them to you. But please also do raise your virtual hand, and we can bring you in to ask the question actually live. I think that's always more engaging. But Cosmin Tugui is asking the question: are there proposals in these reports for reforming the EU institutions in order to increase their representativity, or for introducing more practices of deliberative democracy? So I'll just read three, and then you choose who picks which one. Steffen Schumacher asks, well, how to better avoid that state leaders like Orban misuse European subsidies for their countries and enrich themselves. So this issue of conditionality in NGU, I think is perhaps not yet fully convincing. So perhaps we can enlarge a bit more on, can we really stop money from flowing if it requires ultimately a decision in the European Council and nobody wants to pick on the others. And Deger Akal is asking, okay, that's a long one. Let me still read it. Turkey's strategic importance has increased in recent years. It's also important as an economic partner, and with regard to energy and economic corridors linking Europe and Middle Asia, East Asia. But at the same time, Turkey is far away from meeting the Copenhagen criteria for EU membership, human rights, etc. So what could be the options for EU-Turkey relations, and how do you think, is this an associate member, or what is the best option for Turkey in your sort of multi-speed different circles? Okay, so I think these are three very interesting questions. I don't know who wants to start. Perhaps Daniela, you start and try to be concise so that each of you gets a chance to pick something. Please.
Okay, so I'll quickly start with Turkey, but I can also pick up others if Shane, you don't want to answer them. So Turkey, of course, is officially a candidate, but there are no negotiations. So I must say that as a group, we did not discuss country cases as much, and definitely not Turkey. We did look at principles for accession because we have two countries that are candidates and will probably start their negotiations in December, who have conflict on their territory. So we looked into that question and answered it in a principle, not in a country-specific way. But Turkey, we didn't situate anywhere specifically after making a deep analysis of the country. So let me comment on associate membership in a more principled way. So basically what we say is associate membership as an outer ring to the core EU still needs full compliance with the rule of law principle and other EU principles, because part of it would be access to the single market. That's the way how we phrase it. So for Turkey, the condition to become part of this wouldn't be possible, in particular, given your analysis, what the situation in the country is, would be difficult to meet even for that. But of course, if Turkey is interested to structure its relationship more closely with the EU and to have market access, but also a framework where it's not just a bilateral trade agreement, then associate membership would be something interesting for Turkey to explore. But the conditions that we think need to be set because of the single market access, they are pretty clear. So Shane, over to you maybe. And I'm happy if you don't want to answer anything, just pass it back.
No, maybe just to add on this, I mean, if Turkey is not to become an associate member of the EU, one thing we mentioned a bit in passing in the report, but which Daniela and I have written about in another place, is that we view the future of the EU sort of outer layer in the form of the European political community to be an outer layer that will be more integrated and more structured than it is today. And so what we mean by that is that to us, the EPC in the future should be a real forum for the coordination on energy, for instance, on defense and other matters. And and that could be if Turkey, for a reason or another, cannot or doesn't want to reach the associate membership or the full EU membership, be a place that is in fact more suitable. And that point about Turkey may apply to other countries, whether it is the UK, or may also apply to countries that are currently in the EU, and that for a number of reasons, in particular because they don't want to meet the requirement of the rule of law, decide to slip to a looser form of cooperation with the EU.
Wonderful. Perhaps, Elmar, you can take the question on the misuse of European subsidies by Orban that was asked here by Steffen Schumacher, and how do we prevent that next generation EU funds or successors to these kind of expenditure programs, spending programs, how do we control them? I mean, does it work really, the mechanism that we have on currently in Next Generation EU? Elmar, I think you are muted. You have to unmute yourself.
In a way, yes, I'm here in the strategic meeting of the EPP group for preparation of the European election. I had yesterday a discussion with Monica Hohlmeier about it, who is chair of the Budget Control Committee, the European Parliament, to deal with that. I think it works. And then a very interesting instrument to use that, and they have not got money until that from Next Generation, in a way. But the report broadens this question. It says that it's not enough to use that. It must be for the ordinary budget. And have also other mechanisms and go out of that de facto veto system, which you have when you have one partner from Poland that can stop everything in the council. Therefore, this system must be broadened, and I think the report has good proposals for that. But here again, it's not mentioned, at least I have not seen it, the role of the European Court of Justice, which can play a role in that question too, and strengthen that. And what I want to say about this deliberative democracy, there's one point which makes me angry all the time. Delegated acts, and especially implementing acts, is the instrument of the European bureaucracy, make deals with the national bureaucracies, and the legislators, Parliament and Council, have no legal rights to call back legislation if this acts on a misuse of the original legislation. This is the cause of detailed bureaucracy, which is done in that level. It's a small practical point, but a very important practical point in practice. And perhaps Daniela Shahin, it might be a point to mention. To Turkey, only one sentence. Turkey has an association agreement, is in the customs union. What we should do now is to modernize the customs union. It does not change anything. We should modernize the customs union because products and other things change. This would be a good sign to Turkey that they can expect something from Europe, and it's binding Europe. 2/3 of the investments in Turkey is still done from the European Union. So Erdogan relies on European investment, and therefore we should also modernize the customs union. And one last sentence, enlargement also is part of that circle proposals, is we have a very good solution already for that. That is the European Economic Area, the Norwegian model. This can be used in a practical way also for candidate countries like Ukraine, who will not become from the first moment members of the European Union. But give the people, that is also for the Balkans, the people must see progress. They must see especially progress in economic policy, what is in for them. And here you have to use, because the enlargement process lasts very long, steps in between, which makes people happy that we take them seriously. And here, this type of Norwegian solution would be a very interesting instrument.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes left and 2 questions. So let me quickly summarize the questions, and Daniela, perhaps you can really have a quick stab at them, and then we have to conclude. There's a question by Georgi Filipov, which is a question on North Macedonia, and it's really about the proposal to abolish veto through the introduction of the principle of decision-making by qualified majority voting. How much will this actually, this kind of reform, speed up enlargement process, and what does it mean in the context of obligations for constitutional changes? So that's the question, I guess, of constitutional changes in North Macedonia. That's very specific. But then there is the broader question, I would say, is really about, I mean, going beyond the North Macedonian case, whether your proposal to first do the bulk of the internal reforms before really doing enlargement. It's really not a way of delaying or making membership slower, or having staggered some staggered membership and not full membership. And Zoran Nechev is asking whether you can elaborate more on the grouping of countries for accession. What kind of groups do you have in mind, and how do you protect the accession process from misuse by EU member states on issues that have nothing to do with the Copenhagen criteria? Yeah? I mean, so I think these are quite related, and I think very hot topics, certainly on the Balkans, and the North Macedonian case, of course, with the blocking first of France and then of Bulgaria, and related to the question of mentioning of Bulgarian nationals in the North Macedonian constitution, I think is certainly a hot topic. So just very quickly, you have 1 minute basically. So, and you're muted. Sorry.
The report is not about the enlargement and accession process, but you will see some points because we found it so important to make certain comments. But I think the whole question of staggered integration, of moving in more gradually, is hugely important. We generally support the principle to flexibilize the integration process, but we do not make concrete proposals because that wasn't our task. Now, let me simply say a few things. First of all, we suggest to move. So we focused on the decision-making in enlargement. We suggest to move the decisions of opening chapters and proceeding in the process to qualified majority voting. But linking that to your question on constitutional change and North Macedonia, the point is here that this will not take away at the end the veto of EU countries that are, that have to vote on the accession treaty in the end. So while we are aware that it can only accelerate the process, at the end, this does not solve the issue that in the case of North Macedonia, there's a clear request for a constitutional change. We discussed this back and forth, but we simply think that we cannot move the EU as it is to a qualified majority vote on admitting new members. That, from our perspective, from a legitimacy, but also political perspective, and a legal perspective, does not work. For groupings, we discussed, should we argue for all of them staying together, or should we have a more flexible approach? And we actually think that a more flexible approach is useful. However, we say, as a principle, if two candidate countries have, for instance, a territorial issue or a mutual recognition issue, we of course thought of Serbia and Kosovo, this process should be structured in a way that they move together so we can prevent one country going in vetoing the other. That puts more pressure not only on the two countries, but also on the EU to engage more for an actual resolution of the conflict. On the question of timing, last half minute, the 2030 goal for us is an ambitious target, and we really think the EU needs to send such a signal because it recredibilizes the whole accession perspective in the candidate countries. We do not think that the sequence we suggest, because we actually have reform proposals which can be solved in the short term, that this necessarily causes an extra delay. For us, what counts is that the EU commits and starts sending very, very dedicated signals. We are serious, because what we hear at the moment is that many candidate countries actually doubt that the EU is moving, and that excuses their non-action on their own preparation. And I think we have to get out of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So for all of those in the audience who want to delve deeper into this, go to the report, but also go to IP Quarterly, our magazine, where we have just published several reports, several papers on enlargement questions. Do go on our website, IP Quarterly. And let me really thank you, Elmar Brok, Shaheen Ballet, Daniela Schwarzer, for engaging in the discussion, and thank you also to our audience for the great questions. Until next time, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Gudrun. Bye.